Hi, Tim.
Hey, Will.
How's it going?
Going very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing excellently. It's been a little bit cold here in Washington, D.C. You are in St. Louis, Missouri.
That is correct, which has very similar weather.
Very similar weather. For the benefit of our listeners, I'm Will Wilkinson here at the Cato Institute. And Tim, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Tim Lee, and I'm an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, but I'm not on the payroll or in the building there at all. I live here in St. Louis, and I write about technology issues. Yeah,
Tim is my tech guru, insofar as I have a tech guru, and writes on topics in tech policy, online privacy, telecom, all sorts of stuff about just the way the internet works that I don't really know anything about. And so the reason I want to talk to you, Tim, is that I'd like to find a little bit about this stuff. So for those viewers who are worried about having to put up with, an hour of Cato-affiliated libertarian on libertarian action, I assure you that what's going on here is that I'm going to learn about the ins and outs of tech policy from Tim, and attempt to argue with him if I decide that I disagree. But I don't know if I disagree or not in advance, because I really don't know what I think about a lot of these issues. But I'll try to play a little bit of devil's advocate.
And these are issues, some of them that a lot of libertarians have disagreements about, so we very well might not end up agreeing on all the subjects.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one of the things that's interesting about tech policy, is because the sort of infrastructure of the internet is unique. It's not like the way the non-virtual world works, and so our sort of rote ideas about how to regulate things don't necessarily apply. So things about, privacy, DRM, things like that tend to cut across ideological boundaries in interesting ways. So maybe some of that'll come out. But
Absolutely.
Tim, to start, let's do something that I try to assiduously avoid doing here on Free Will, which is talking about some actual news. So there's this kerfuffle. How do you say that? Kerfuffle? Is it kerfuffle or kerfluffle, Tim?
Kerfuffle, I think.
Without the.
But that's just a guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's this this bill. What's it called? The Protect America Act.
Yep.
There's a little bit of conflict going on in Congress right now about that. Can you tell us what the Protect America Act is about, and what the political issue is that's causing some problems in Congress?
Sure. Well, I think to understand it, you need to know a little bit about the history. The basic legislation that's being discussed is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was passed in 1978 and has been updated a number of times, which governs domestic intelligence gathering, so the activities of the NSA, CIA, organizations like that.
That's better known as FISA. That's what people mean when they say FISA.
That's right. And so last year, the president, there was apparently a ruling that FISA set up this secret court called the FISA court that oversees these surveillance activities and issues special warrants that are that are more secretive and have slightly different standards than normal law enforcement warrants. And last year, this court issued a ruling that the president has characterized as limiting the ability of the executive branch to engage in this surveillance. And so last August, the president pushed Congress very hard to change the way that worked, to change FISA so that the executive branch has a lot more authority, basically to engage in warrantless surveillance of domestic to international calls. So if you've got, say, a cousin who's in the UK and you make a phone call to that person under the pre-Protect America Act regime, they would have needed to go to the FISA court to get a warrant in order to intercept that call. Under the Protect America Act, they would be able to just have the Attorney General issue an authorization, quote-unquote, saying that they're allowed to do this, but they never actually have to talk to a court and get a formal warrant.
Mm-hmm. So now the president can't just listen. Like, if I call you from Washington D.C., you're in St. Louis. They totally have to get like a completely ordinary warrant in order to listen in on that kind of domestic call, right?
Well, they could. If it depends on what their rationale is. If they suspect you of I don't know, murder or something, then yes, they go through the ordinary warrant process, go to a non-secret judge and get a non-secret warrant. If they suspected you of being a spy or a terrorist, they could still go to the FISA court and get a FISA warrant. And pretty much everybody agrees that when you're talking about domestic-to-domestic communications, that there needs to be a judicial oversight of that. The real debate is about domestic-to-foreign communications, or where you've got one end of the communication is an American and the other end is somewhere else.
Now, so one of the things that I guess is a controversial aspect of was it the Senate version of this bill it gives companies who have assisted the government in tapping phones sort of retroactive amnesty for breaking what was the previous law. Is that the right characterization?
That's right. So what FISA did, among other things, is it said that you got to get this warrant if you want to eavesdrop on certain kinds of calls, and it said that it's illegal for the companies who are asked to participate in these programs to turn over information to the government unless they have one of these warrants. It says that FISA is the exclusive means for permitting you to essentially invade the privacy of your customers. And there have been press reports that since September 11th, and in fact even a little bit before September 11th, the Bush administration has started at least one and possibly several programs where they just went to AT&T and Verizon and Qwest and Sprint and these other companies and said, we don't have a warrant, we don't think it's necessary, we would like you to just give us your customers. In one case it's their call records, in another case it's access to the actual content of the phone calls for certain individuals. And the press reports suggest that at least some of those companies followed complied with the request and said, okay, here's access to our customers' private information. We're not going to require you to go to the FISA court and get a warrant before we'll share this information with you. Mm-hmm. And so the Bush administration has been pushing very hard, and obviously the phone companies, AT&T and Verizon, have been lobbying Congress very hard for legislation that basically says any company that cooperated in a White House surveillance program since the September 11th attacks are not liable, even if they happen to have violated the restrictions in FISA.
So let me get this straight. So what's happening is that the Bush administration is going to the phone companies and saying, admitting that, like, okay, like AT&T, we know that what we're asking you to do is actually against the law, so it's illegal for you to do it. But we're going to give you this assurance that we'll protect you. If anything, then it's okay. It's okay. You don't have to worry about it. You can believe me. I'm the president. That's kind of what's going on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we don't know for sure what they told them. They may have had some legal argument about this is legal because I as the president have the inherent authority to spy on terrorists, or they have some novel statutory interpretation. But they definitely said, we promise you this is legal and we'll protect you if anybody tries to hold you accountable. And the phone companies apparently bought those assurances.
Well, were there any telecom companies that decided to just said, stuff it?
There were, in fact, at least reportedly. And again, one of the problems with this is all classified, and so all we have to go on is press accounts that may or may not be perfectly accurate. But the former CEO of Qwest, which is one of the three major telephone companies now, he claims at least that the NSA came to him and said, we want you to share call records with us about the calling habits of your customers, and he said, come back when you have a warrant. And he claims that the NSA retaliated for that by canceling some lucrative government contracts that they had been enjoying. And so not only did Qwest, piss off the Bush administration, but they actually, at least if this CEO's story is true, actually suffered a financial loss for insisting on following the law. In contrast, Verizon and AT&T reportedly agreed to participate in this program and presumably have had more access to government contract opportunities than Quest did.
No, well, that's a little troubling. But let's get back to this issue. You're saying that of course, like all these companies, AT&T, Verizon, they've got a lot of lawyers who know what the law is, and maybe they really did think that this is actually, in the end, constitutional. It may be because the law that tells us that we can't do it is unconstitutional because the president has these inherent authority, set forth in Article 2 or something like that. It says that he gets to conduct surveillance on, gather intelligence on, sort of foreign agents that might be threats to the state. Something that the president can just do, and that and that the restriction on executive power to gather this kind of intelligence is pretty new. That it was 1967, right? That the Supreme Court decided that the executive was going to need something like a warrant for electronic surveillance. And so couldn't you make an argument that really, as disturbing as the prospect of having your privacy invaded by the government, this is just a necessary part of the executive doing its duty to protect Americans against dangerous foreign elements.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it certainly is true that when we're talking about foreign surveillance, if we're talking about bugging cell phone towers in Iraq, it certainly is. There's a strong argument that the president shouldn't have to get a warrant, and in fact he doesn't. As long as the target of the surveillance is not an American and the activity is happening overseas, FISA does not control it all. But when we're talking about domestic surveillance, the problem you have is that you got to have some sort of limits, because you see this issue coming up over and over again when you're talking about civil liberties issues. We have issues about the president arresting some American citizen and holding him as an enemy combatant. You have questions about torture and other issues where if you allow the president to simply declare, X is a national security issue and therefore I'm entitled to do whatever I want with X, that completely removes any sort of judicial oversight of any activities the president decides to sort of invoke those magic words. And if the Constitution is designed to mean anything, it certainly cannot be interpreted to say that the president is completely unconstrained in the way he behaves in the domestic sphere. And so I don't think you can. There certainly are people who've made that argument, but I think it is inconsistent with the goals of having a Fourth Amendment, of having a judiciary and a warrant process. You can certainly have reasonable disagreements about where the line should be drawn, but I think at some level, when the president is eavesdropping on an American citizen on American soil, I don't think you can say that Congress and the courts have nothing to say about that. That just isn't the way our Constitution works.
Right. So we want that conflict, right? The essence of the separation of powers is that different branches of the government can stop the other branches from doing anything, right? And I think, like you said, if the president can just say, "Oh, look, this is a matter of national security. I'm going to do what I need to do." And this is the thing that frustrates me when I hear about these debates. And you're like, "Well, what is it that you need to do?" "Well, I can't tell you because that would imperil national security." And then you're like, "Well, what is it that you want to do?" "Well, I can't tell you." "What's the reason that you want to do it?" Sorry, if I told you I'd have to kill you. And then you're like, "How do we know that you're not spying on citizens, that you're not violating people's Fourth Amendment rights, that you're not, et cetera, et cetera?" And the answer can never be anything more than, "Well, you just have to trust us."
Right, and that's something that the Bush administration has been particularly aggressive about. If you read some of the court filings, so there's been these lawsuits against the phone companies saying, you violated the law, you violated our privacy, and the Bush administration has consistently filed these briefs saying, we can neither confirm nor deny whether these companies have participated in these programs, but if they had, they would be a secret, and therefore you should just throw it out without asking any questions, because even litigating the case might expose secrets that would, endanger national security. And as you say, I mean, if either the president is accountable or he's not, and if he just gets a get-out-of-jail-free card anytime he utters the phrase national security, that means that the president is completely unconstrained.
But I think the interesting question is here that, I mean, obviously there's a real interest in protecting citizens against, say, terrorist attacks. And if there are terrorists, there are terrorist cells. Imagine it's an episode of 24, which is what the Bush administration wants us to imagine the world is like. Yep. So, imagine that they're just all these terrorist cells are just all over the place. And what we have is the government has means of monitoring communications of people that they already suspect of being terrorists. But there's really not, like, how do you find out who is a terrorist if you have to already know that they're a terrorist in the first place in order to get a warrant, in order to eavesdrop on them? Are the limitations that are imposed by FISA and other kinds of regulations, does that actually really hamper? I mean, this is what I hear the Bush administration saying, is that these things are outdated, that it doesn't it's not cognizant of the reality of fighting a war on terror in an age of sort of new communication, and that if we're going to find out who the terrorists are, we have to use these means at our disposal, and the Constitution is not a death warrant,
Right. Well, one of my favorite
or a suicide
commentators.
That's the end of that. Not a suicide.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite commenters on national security issues is a guy named Bruce Schneider, who's a cryptography researcher. And one of the things he says is that if you're watching everybody, you're watching nobody. And I think people have this sort of mystical vision of technology where if you just take all the data and you stick it in a computer and you turn the crank and out will pop out information about who's a terrorist. And I think the way these technologies actually works isn't really like that. The technology that's usually cited is what's known as data mining, which is the sort of thing that, say, credit card companies use to decide, who's likely to be interested in their credit card offers or whatever. But those programs, and those programs usually rely on having a lot of data about past purchase habits. So, each customer, they might have 100 data points about, what that person has purchased. Whereas with the terrorist, we have a terrorist attack every 10 years. That just isn't enough raw data for the algorithms to come up with any sort of patterns. And so I don't think there's much reason to think that those sorts of algorithms are effective. What's effective against terrorism is the sort of thing that we saw in London that stopped the liquid bomber that's responsible for us not being able to take shampoo on the airport now, and that was basically aggressive police work. It was boots on the ground in the UK where they knew somebody had terrorist ties. They got a police warrant to bug his phone. They found out who he was calling. They figured out who they were talking about terroristy stuff to. They bugged all their phones. They did stakeouts. I mean, they did the sort of traditional police work that police officers have been doing for decades, if not centuries. And, it's a little bit more high-tech now. We have better surveillance methods and so forth, but it's still the kind of anti-terrorism efforts that are really effective are the on-the-ground, labor-intensive kind of terrorist activity, of investigative activity that requires a lot of people, but it doesn't require having the private communications of the hundreds of millions of Americans who have absolutely nothing to do with terrorism.
Yeah, I really think that the movies have a lot to do with I was watching the latest Bourne movie on the on an airplane recently, and the government agencies, like what you always see, they always have there's the movie computer that you can search for any piece of information on, that come on, searching, oh no, I need a password. Okay, hack it. We hacked the password, and then you get this piece of data, and that so the sort of Hollywood imagination is actually one in which the government has this kind of omnipotence, and that the search that there are databases somewhere that have every pertinent piece of information, and that they are structured so rationally, and the search functions are so magical that you can find any piece of information instantly, and that any sort of pattern of activity going through the grid, whatever the grid is, right? There's something's happening on the grid. Oh, this person just purchased a candy bar in Tuscaloosa and just bought a Camaro in, Birmingham, and that fits the profile of a serial killer, right? Like, it's just insane, and I think this kind of stuff caters to the idea that there's a kind of that the cost of aggregating information and finding the relevant piece of information is way lower than it actually is. And as you were saying, like if you have like some gigantic set of data, it becomes so hard to search through that it becomes useless.
That's right. If we had 100 terrorist acts a week, then we might be able to build some sort of profile of what a typical terrorist is looking like, and maybe these algorithms would work. But each terrorist attack is very different. The September 11th attack had like 20 people involved. Others are like a lone individual. And so the idea that we have these magical algorithms that can extract from this tiny data set these broad trends that allows us to identify future terrorists, I think is just very unrealistic.
Yeah, the other thing too is and one of the reasons I worry most. It turns out that we are having a libertarian on libertarian action here, but one of the reasons that the security stuff bothers me so much is that I think the fears of attack by an external threat are the easiest sentiments to really rile up in people, and so it's easiest to get people to go along with a limitation on their liberty if it's advanced in those terms than in any other terms. So I think it's really important to be extra vigilant about this stuff because for exactly the reason it's often an effective argument that when Bush says, "Look, we're endangered. Like you're endangering American citizens if we don't give these companies immunity for the law that they broke." That argument is exactly the reason that it requires much greater scrutiny because that kind of fear mongering is really persuasive. But it shouldn't be. I mean, here's one of the controversial things that I like to say about terrorism is that the administration likes to take a lot of credit for why there haven't been more terrorist attacks. I think the best explanation for why there haven't been any significant terrorist attacks after 9/11 is just regression to the mean. They're so it's like a lightning strike, right? What's the best explanation for why the same place isn't hit twice by a bolt of lightning? Well, it's just highly improbable. And so far, these things have been so isolated and spaced out and improbable that the best explanation of why we haven't seen them is because they just don't happen very often. Whereas on some deranged dude just murdered 5 people on the campus of my alma mater, Northern Illinois University. But that's not terrorism, right? That's a crime.
That's right.
If that guy had been a foreign national who waved a sign that said "Death to America," that would have been a terrorist act. And so the response to these things are so. It depends on the frame that's imposed on them, and we ought to do what we can to avoid people from walking into universities and killing people, but it doesn't legitimate a massive ramp-up of the surveillance state, and neither does even quite large terrorist attacks.
Right, and I think that probably when people look back at this era in our history from 50 years from now, it'll look very serious to the attitude towards, the Red Scare of the 50s or the anti-anarchist attitudes of the early 20th century. And I think you're already starting to see a little bit of that happening. I mean, what happened this week was, so the Bush administration has been using these sort of, ultimatums since last August, saying if you don't do X, Y, and Z, this next 24 hours, the terrorists are going to get us. And they finally got to the point where the House Democrats got fed up and said, fine, if you won't give us time to consider this, we're just not going to pass the legislation you want. And the Protect America Act is going to expire on Saturday. And when when no buildings get blown up on Sunday, I think that tactic will have lost a little bit of its bite, and over time, I think people will become acclimated to the Republicans or a certain class of people always say that whatever we do is going to cause a terrorist attack. It's a very potent strategy, but I think it probably will eventually wear off, like almost every political strategy tends to.
Do you think the terrorist alert meter is going to go up to orange if the Protect America Act expires?
That's the sort of thing I would not put past them. I mean, one of the things you see is that the Bush administration does seem to be quite shameless about when they feel like stepping up the pressure. They release these statements about we've seen, quote unquote, increased terrorist activity, and there's never any specifics. It's never, we think that
they've seen activity
Alabama
on the grid.
Right, and so these are completely unfalsifiable, and there's absolutely no. I don't know what I'm supposed to do if I hear that their alert level has gone up to orange. Am I supposed to, drive slower and be looking around me for terrorists? I mean, it's not clear what purpose that serves other than just ratcheting up the general level of fear. And eventually, I think people are going to get desensitized to that, but it just takes a long time.
Well, let's move on to another topic, Tim. Privacy related. So the government is definitely a threat to your privacy, whether or not you think it's actually making us safer. But it's not the only threat to our privacy. We've got, like you mentioned, that credit card companies do a lot of data mining to find things out about us. Whenever I sweep my giant extra value card or whatever it is, they keep a record of all my purchases, and there's all sorts of whenever I log in online, I've got all sorts of information on Facebook, and so there's been a lot of concerns lately online, in particular about the integrity and privacy of people's data, of their activities, especially with these sort of highly socially connected Web 2.0 endeavors. So tell us about the most recent controversy.
Sure. Well, Facebook, as you mentioned, is one of the most popular sites, Web 2.0 sites, as the buzzword goes. And it's just a social networking site, which means it's a way you log in and you tell the system who all your friends are, and then you can swap messages and swap photographs and so forth. And so Facebook is very popular. It's got millions of users, but they're still trying to figure out how to make money off of this thing. They've got lots of eyeballs, but they're not quite sure how to sell ads well. And so they came up with this program called Beacon, which is basically, say, when you go to Amazon and you purchase a book, they want to have a mechanism where if you're a Facebook user, a notice will automatically show up on your Facebook page saying, Will Wilkinson purchase book X? And that maybe they'd get that Amazon would kick in some money for that in the hopes that somebody else would see that, Will Wilkinson bought that book, maybe I would like to as well.
I was actually really surprised the first time that, the few days that Beacon was running. The thing is, because I had no idea, which... You didn't know who were the affiliates, and so I'd sent a recipe from Epicurious to my cell phone, and then all of a sudden I saw this thing pop up that sent to my Facebook profile. Will Wilkinson has sent the recipe for such and such souffle to his cell phone, and I was like, oh shit. I didn't really care. It was a good dish that reflected well on my taste, but still, I didn't know that I was that everybody that I'd connected to on Facebook was going to know what I was making for dinner that night.
Yep. And so this is the problem that the Web 2.0 companies are facing, and I think the fundamental problem is that they're doing things with data that were technically and physically impossible even 10 years ago. There didn't exist anything even remotely like Facebook before the internet came along. And so they're still sort of trying to figure out what the rules are. What things do consumers like, what things do consumers not like, and obviously gets people very riled up. I think Beacon is an example where it was a promising idea on paper, but as it turns out, it doesn't. It's not all that great, and consumers really don't like it. And Facebook has backpedaled pretty heavily, and they are now.
But they went through an earlier iteration of this controversy because, I forget, I forget what a year and a half ago or 2 years ago when they first, because you didn't used to be able to see everything that everybody did on Facebook right now. Like, what do they call that?
That was their news feed. That's right. So it was sort of, and people forget this now, but yeah, in late 2006 they introduced this news feed where, if say, God forbid, if you break up with your girlfriend, and you change your, I assume that won't happen, but just hypothetically, and you change your status from it's complicated to single. Originally with Facebook, the only way people would have noticed that is if they'd checked your site before, noticed its complicated status, and then checked it again and noticed the single status. They changed it so that there'd be a little item in this, what's called a news feed that's on everybody's page that says, well, Wilkinson changed status from X to Y. And this was intensely controversial. There was something like 700,000 users joined this group saying, Facebook, please get rid of this horrible feature. And in this case, Facebook did not back down as they had with Beacon. They made some changes. They allowed you to opt out of certain aspects of it. But they said, no, we think this is a feature that users will like when they come to get more acquainted with it. And I think pretty much all Facebook users now would agree that was the right decision. I mean, it's certainly when I wasn't cool enough to.
It's kind of the best feature about Facebook.
That's right. I was not cool enough to
see what's happening to all these people.
That's right, and when I joined in early 2007, it had already gone in place. It never occurred to me that would be something that would upset me. Mm-hmm. And so you've got in the offline world, you have well-developed norms about these activities. Peering in somebody's window, that's a violation of somebody's privacy. Overhearing a conversation at a party, maybe that's not a violation of people's privacy. I don't think we yet have those kinds of intuitions about the way the online world works. And we're still, and the only way we're really going to do that is we got to try stuff. We got to try Beacon and say, nope, that's too much of an invasion of privacy. We got to try the newsfeed and say, okay, I guess I see the benefits of that. And we're really still groping our way towards the kinds of social conventions that I think, 20 or 30 years from now, we'll probably all agree that this is good and this is bad, but I don't think we've developed that yet, which I think is very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, but that might never happen. I mean, like this is one of the things that's interesting about the lag in sort of cultural adaptation to technological change, is that in order for the cultural norms to really reach a point of sort of fixation in the population, the thing that they're adapting to has to remain stable long enough. But if the technology keeps changing, you just have this sort of dynamic set of shifting norms that never really settle on an equilibrium, because the underlying sort of structure that these norms and new conventions are responsive to keeps shifting. So I mean, maybe you're right that there'll be some. We'll settle on the fact that it seemed like the boundary that people were objecting to with the Beacon thing versus the newsfeed thing was that the newsfeed thing, people kind of understood that it was giving people updates of things that were happening inside of Facebook. And the Beacon was giving people updates on the activities of users outside of Facebook. And people kind of felt like they hadn't agreed to reveal that information. They had, in fact, agreed to reveal that information, but they didn't know it. And that's one of the problems involved in a lot of these privacy online, is that you should ideally, like if information and transaction costs are zero, you should be able to ideally tailor contracts so that each individual is perfectly satisfied with the terms of their user agreement. But in fact, nobody ever reads their user agreement because it just takes too long, and so people.
That's right. And you've probably experienced when you get a new Facebook application, you've probably seen the page that has like 4 check boxes that says this application can read my profile and can see my friends, et cetera, et cetera.
Can test your blood.
And that's right, and I mean that's a good example of the kind of information problem these sites face, because on the one hand, they want to give users some fine-grained control over which things they want to share and which things they don't. But, if they had 50 checkboxes, you wouldn't read all the checkboxes. You just click the OK button, or you wouldn't, either way, because the consenting or not consenting. And it's the same thing with your Epicurious recipe. I'm sure there was somewhere on the page where you clicked the Epicurious, there was probably some notification saying, click this checkbox if you don't want to get the beacon notification. But, you were busy. You don't have time to read every single word on every web page you visit.
Well, I probably already agreed in advance. Like I had to check some box when I signed up for an account on Epicurious, and there was a provision there that's going to say something like, Epicurious, reserves the right to share your data with sort of affiliates that we've deemed to be blah blah blah, and they just did, and I wasn't upset about it. I was just surprised, but
right.
But lots of people were upset, and so where do you think people are gonna? I mean, so I think part of it is like if I knew in advance, right? Like like the first time it did it, if there was a big thing that popped up and says, "Do you want to share your Epicurious data with Facebook?" Then, if you make out opt-outs easy like that, I think people don't mind them that much. And the thing is, I might have checked it. I might have thought it was fun to let people know what recipes I was using, because I'm not nervous or ashamed of my my recipes.
Well, I think this is where social norms and in a sense metaphors come in. I mean, I think that what needs to happen is that people need to have a set of common expectations about, where on the page do you look for the checkbox that says whether this information is going to be shared, or I mean, people don't have very sophisticated mental maps or heuristics about what is and isn't a privacy violation, and so as people get more familiar with these things, I think there will be better feelings about what the defaults ought to be, because the problem is you just can't disclose every bit of information about how everything is used, because Google has 1,000 different pieces of information about you, and they can't possibly disclose to you everything they use about every way they use that information. But if people have some settled expectations about which things are and are not privacy violations, then it's much easier to move the needle a little bit away from those defaults and say, well, we're going to do the default thing, except we're also going to do this other thing with your data. And then you can consider whether that incremental change is acceptable or not. But right now the technology is developing so fast that they're doing too many things with your data to disclose all of them to you and get your consent. And so it's difficult. I'm not sure. I do think, though, about the perpetual nature of technological change. I think what happens is usually any given technology has a growth spurt, like the telephone, for example. There was a period from 1880 to 1920 or 30 or something where the telephone was a new thing. I'm sure there were, in fact, I was recently reading, party lines used to be very common in rural areas where there'd be 5 or 10 families that all had the same phone, and I'm sure there were debates about, is it ethical to listen on your neighbor's conversations? Those sorts of things. But then there was a point in maybe 1940 where everybody had a telephone, sort of gelled about, here's how you're supposed to answer the telephone, here's when it's okay and not okay to listen in on conversations, etc. And then since then, telephones have basically been a stable technology, at least until Skype and stuff like that came up. And so I think you'll see the same thing. In fact, I think with email, not that much has changed about email in the last 5 or 10 years. It's pretty much the same thing it was 5 or 10 years ago. And so with any given aspect of the Internet, I think there'll be a period, like social networking sites are still new enough that they're changing very rapidly. But at some point, one of the social networking sites will find the sort of winning formula that everybody likes. Everybody else will copy them, and then you'll have it'll sort of start to stabilize in a way that we would more recognize. And I think we just haven't quite reached that point. But there will always be, I think, new applications that are different from what's already been there that will have these sorts of unsettled norms. But I don't think that prevents norms from settling in technologies that have been around for a while.
I guess the flip side of privacy norms is sort of, I don't know what to call it, like voyeurism norms, where some people, and I think I'm actually one of those people. Not that I'm a voyeur normally, but I don't try to assiduously protect my online data, or I'm not worried about remaining anonymous. I've always signed comments on other people's blogs with my real name, and just having a blog, say, is exposing yourself in a way that maybe would have seemed unseemly to a prior generation, and being on web TV and video logging and things like we're doing now might seem like vain, but so there, I think my expectations of how much privacy I'm going to have, given what I'm willing to put out there, is kind of different than what, because the technologies enable you to put yourself out there in a different way than you could in the past. And so that bears on like how much privacy you expect.
That's right. And I think photos are a great example of this. I mean, I suspect my parents would never put their family photo albums on the internet. I mean, they might put it up with a password, and in fact, I've got friends. I've got a friend who just had a kid, and I asked him, "Well, are you going to put pictures of your baby on the internet?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. That might be a little bit personal." And I don't see any reason why. I'll put pictures of my kids on the internet. Maybe I'll feel differently once I actually have kids, but certainly I put pictures of me and my friends and family on the internet, and I think that is, like you said, it's just something that you couldn't do until about 10 years ago, and so people sort of abstracted from other situations where they wouldn't put information about themselves on the internet. But I think in 10 or 20 years, anybody who's under 50 will consider it perfectly normal that you put all your photos on the internet, at least for all your friends to see, and probably for the whole world to see if they want. Not that anybody would necessarily be interested.
Well, that's a big part of, I guess, Web 2.0 is this idea of like user-generated content, and a lot of these sites, Facebook, Flickr, they really don't have anything other than what people put on them, right?
Yep.
And so you're kind of, I mean, and I had a thought, but I kind of lost it. Those sites, their ability to sustain themselves isn't... Well, so part of it is... So when I joined Flickr for the first time, I ended up paying a fee in order to be able to store as many pictures as I wanted to. But a lot of places are moving away from that kind of structure, right? A lot of places are just giving away things for free these days. Like there was a point in time when you couldn't expect to get free email, but now you can get like free email with as much storage as you might ever conceivably need. And so I'm lamely trying to make a segue into our next topic about whether or not you can really give things away for free on the internet. I guess the better segue would have been the reason that Facebook is what did Beacon in the first place is that they need to generate ad revenue in order to, or revenue from people trying to sell things over time in order to sustain themselves. And so the privacy issue kind of ties in to giving away stuff for free, because when they're giving it away from free, they want to be able to use your data in a way that allows them to sell things to you. So that was the case with the controversy over Gmail, right? So Gmail was mining people's emails in order to serve them targeted ads. And so there's a perfect confluence between the privacy issue and the ability of places to make money giving stuff away.
That's right, and this is, I think, is one aspect of the shifting norms. It's not just a question of what uses of data people like, but it's also a question of what uses of data will people accept in exchange for things they like. So, for example, Gmail, as you mentioned, at the time, I think Hotmail had something ridiculous like a 2 megabyte storage space availability, and so Gmail came along and said, we'll increase it by a factor of 500, but you have to put up with these ads that are based on the contents of your emails. And that was a choice consumers faced, and some people at the very beginning were very outraged by this and said, that's an invasion of my privacy to base the contents of advertisement based on the contents of emails. And I think this is another case where now most of the people who started using Gmail found out that it didn't bother them very much, and it's now fairly widely accepted that this is an okay thing to do. And so I think you're seeing people, I think, gradually their attitudes about that sort of thing are changing. But it's certainly an interesting question about the extent to which it will be possible to earn a living, pay for these sorts of services without charging people directly. But so far, I think it's been very successful. One of the things that I think Google has one of the insights they've had is that I think the traditional view of advertising is that advertising is sort of the spinach you have to eat before you get the dessert of the TV show or the song or whatever you want to listen to. And I think that is an artifact of the primitive 20th century technologies that we had. I mean, the problem was that That's right. The problem was that the TV station, say, has no way of targeting the advertising, and so when I watch TV, I have to watch ads for cars I can't afford and feminine products and all sorts of stuff that I obviously have.
Which you definitely don't need.
Which I also have no use for. And so on the internet, when I do a Google search, it shows me a search term that their algorithms, which they have lots of data for, shows that other people who have searched the same term tend to click on that particular ad. And so it's actually not only are they able to show me fewer ads because they have a higher click-through rate, but it's not even necessarily annoying to have, if I search for airline tickets and I get links to American and United and Continental Airline, that doesn't annoy me. That might actually be what I was looking for, and I'm perfectly happy to have companies bid for the opportunity to more easily, give me the products and services I was interested in getting anyway. And so I think one of the big stories about how these companies are going to pay for stuff is they need to find ways of selling ads or other business models that involve monetizing eyeballs that are actually that view the customer as here's the advertising is almost an additional value that they add to the product, as opposed to the spinach that they make you eat before you're able to get the content. And one of the things that really annoys me is a lot of the larger sites, when they give you a quote-unquote welcome screen, where you have to watch some sort of full-screen ad for some car I'm not going to buy or something.
Like Salon does when you try to click through to one of their articles.
Right, exactly. And I think, or The Economist, for example, did that for a long time. I think that's going to become increasingly uncommon because I think that's mostly an artifact of companies that are still used to the advertising as spinach model and say, we're not subjecting our people to enough ads, how do we make them watch more? Whereas what they should be saying is, our ads obviously aren't relevant enough, how do we find ways to make these ads more interesting to our customers? And frankly, if you have to force your customer to watch the ad by not showing them the content they asked for, that's not a sign that you're not showing them enough ads, it's a sign that the ad wasn't very good. And I think the best companies like Google are finding ways to do that.
Have you seen any ads on Blogging Heads TV, Tim?
I don't remember.
No. You haven't seen any ads on Blogging Heads TV because Blogging Heads TV's business model is slave labor.
You mean you're not going to be getting rich from this podcast, Will?
No. I'm richer for the knowledge that you are conveying to me, Tim. But no, not a dime in my pocket. But I hope Bob is somehow cashing in. Maybe he'll share it with some of us someday. But I'm sure someday in the future you may see there's less obtrusive ads for things like videos. So the original model of advertising for videos which is still quite prevalent, is you start the video that you wanted to watch. It shows you a 10-second ad. And then you get to watch the video. But I've also seen these little things, those little pop-up things, at the bottom of the screen, that kind of like a chyron that runs across. When you're watching CNN, there's always and it can advertise to you while you're watching the content. And if those things, that's a little more unobtrusive. And then if it's incredibly well targeted, if it just happens to know that people who want to watch Free Will on Blogging Heads TV are going to want to see this particular movie. Then somebody watching this show sees the ad for that movie and will say, hey, I think I'd really like to go see that. And in that sense, the informational function of advertising is well served. But Tim, you seem to be really married to this idea that the function of advertising is letting people know about products that they might want to buy. But a lot of people just see ads as corporations and marketing agencies and advertising firms trying to brainwash them into, desiring things that they don't want or they don't need. And so a lot of people are really resistant. The people who put out, what's that magazine? I'm thinking of No Logo, but there's Adbusters, right? So the Adbusters types it has to drive them crazy that they can't go anywhere on the internet without being advertised to, because that's just an assault on your consciousness, right? Like, you can't be an autonomous person if people who are specialized in the latest brainwashing techniques are constantly chipping away at you. Can you, Tim?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good point, and I mean, there certainly are websites. I mean, Blogging Heads TV you mentioned, and Wikipedia. I mean, there are successful websites that do not involve advertising, and I mean, again, I guess we're going into. Yeah, I guess we're going to the libertarian sermonizing again. But, I mean, people, if a significant number of consumers feel that way, you would expect websites that either have a subscription fee or have some other business model to be more prevalent. It seems that most consumers are not as concerned about this. But I also think that one of the things that the Adbusters types find particularly conspicuous is that the advertising they do tends to be it tends to be very focused on general branding as opposed to giving specific information. And I think that one thing they maybe will like is that the internet, because it can be very targeted and because consumers are a lot pickier, I think the ads tend to be more substantive. It tends to more be, here's a product you can buy, or here's a specific fact about our product that you might not have known, as opposed to Swedish women in bikinis or whatever. And I think
can you buy those
that
now?
trend. No, you can't buy them, but they're often used to advertise other products.
I see. I didn't know if they were on the market. I could be interested, but
for example, sometimes alcoholic beverages are sold with the help of buxom women, and usually there's not a close tie between the women and the product being sold. It's a very general
Tim,
sales
I think
pitch.
every time I've ever had a Coors Light, I went home with a very randy supermodel.
Wow.
Yeah, and the thing is I don't drink Coors Light because, frankly, it's exhausting.
So this is another example of the business models we were talking about, right? You're going to be getting a check from Coors once this goes on the site.
God, I hope so. Let's talk a little bit more about how people, about the business models of the internet age, because we're talking about giving away content online. There's also a big debate, and this is another area where libertarians tend to disagree about the appropriateness of patents for things like software. The kind of the normal economy way of rewarding innovators is that if you come up with a new invention that makes some real tangible progress on prior technology, that you can patent it and gain a monopoly over a certain period of time on the sale of that idea. And now a lot of people think that just applies directly to the case of software engineering. But there's a lot of fights about that. There's a lot of people who think that software ought not to be able to be patented. I think are you one of those people, Tim?
Yes, I am. In fact, this in fact is one of my pet issues. There's a couple of issues with patents. One is, or with software patents. One is that software is a little bit unique in that it's one of the very few things that is subject to both copyright and patent law. So most other technologies, like a movie, at least yet, we can't patent a movie. You can get a copyright for it, right, but then that's all you get. On the other hand,
what's the difference between a patent and a copyright?
That is a good question. A copyright is for written or audio or visual works that are fixed in a tangible medium, as the legal jargon goes. So it's for information, basically, that can be copied and shared, whereas a patent is for physical objects or for physical processes. So if you've got a new chemical process for producing some chemical, or you've got some sort of machine, new kind of microchip, you can patent aspects of the physical process. And one of the big differences is with a copyright, receiving the copyright is automatic. When I sent you an email about this about this episode of bloggingheads.tv, my email was copyrighted, and in theory, I could, if you sold that or something without my permission, I could sue you for copyright infringement. Patents are very different. If I invent something and show it to you, and you go off and make a copy of it and do something with it, I'm out of luck unless I have previously gone to the patent office and applied for a patent. And that ends up being very important. I mean, the obvious reason for that is it's very unlikely that if you and I both write novels, that we're going to end up writing exactly the same novel. And so we can assume that if your novel looks exactly like the novel that I published last year, you must have copied it from me. Whereas it's very common to have simultaneous invention or to have inventions that resemble each other. And so that's why we have a formal application process, because you have to actually prove that you were the first inventor, and so you have some evidence that the other person is infringing you and not vice versa.
So, I mean, but what happens online is that, in fact, I mean, so I think a famous case is when Amazon, didn't they try to, like, patent one-click ordering?
That's right. And so, I mean, there's sort of two...
That seems very abstract. That seems like me trying to patent, like, the idea of a novel. So here's my idea. There's a young man, suffering from existential angst, and then he has a big realization, and everything is changed, right? So, and I patent that, and then all of a sudden I can sue, every fifth novelist.
Right, and so there's a general problem and a specific problem. I think the general problem is that one of the rules for getting a patent is that the subject of the patent can't be obvious, and there's lots of legal details that I won't bore you with. But the basic idea is that it should only be for really breakthrough inventions, that you shouldn't just, if you just do something that is, the legal jargon is a person of ordinary skill in the art, shouldn't be able to come up with the invention in a straightforward manner. And so one of the problems is that the courts have watered down this rule so that just totally ridiculous things can be patented. There was a patent in the 1990s, I think, that got some attention, that was a patent on the concept of painting a garbage bag to look like a pumpkin. And
painting a what to look like a pumpkin?
A garbage bag, like a leaf bag.
Oh.
You stick the leaves in the garbage bag, and you stick it out in your front yard, and it looks like you've got a big pumpkin in your yard.
That's a tremendous idea.
Yeah, I mean it's a great idea. I mean, I guess it's very innovative, but so some company that manufactures these orange garbage bags with jack-o'-lanterns painted on them filed for it, and I believe received a patent on this concept of painting a garbage bag to look like a jack-o'-lantern. And I think the courts actually upheld it. It was challenged, and they said that was sufficiently non-obvious that it could get a patent. And
never occurred to me.
Well, yeah, but I mean, there's a question of.
But then again, I'm not in the garbage bag design business.
That's right. So we'd have to find somebody of ordinary skill in the art of designing garbage bags and seeing if they would think of designing one that looks like a pumpkin. But I think the policy question is it the case that this company would not have come up with this idea had they not had the incentive of being able to get a patent for it? And I think it's very difficult to make the argument that this patent was the only thing making them willing to invest the effort to come up with this design for this pumpkin. And so that's the general problem. The specific problem with software is that in some sense I think that that all software suffers from a little bit of this problem, because software is built from very standardized components. You have, you've got a programming language with, 10 or 20 statements, and you combine them in complicated ways to do various things, but it's very difficult. It tends to be a large number of moving parts, none of which is very complicated in itself. And so the way software patents end up actually looking is they tend to be broad descriptions of functionality. So, for example, you might have heard a couple years ago there was a patent that a company sued the makers of the BlackBerry wireless email device that more or less covered sending email wirelessly. I mean, there were a few caveats and so forth, but basically anybody who wanted to be in the wireless email business would have had to get a patent from this company.
I did have that idea like in 1993.
Well, that's right, and in fact there were lots of it's an obvious idea, right? I mean, wireless technology has been around for 100 years, and email had been around for 20 years or so when he patented this idea in the mid-'90s. But the way the courts have interpreted the rules, you have to find a specific piece of paper that describes the exact, that idea in some detail, or else the courts automatically rule that it's not obvious. And I think that, and in fact the Supreme Court said a couple of years ago, look, you have to use some common sense. You have to say, it's not you can't only look, is there a specific piece of paper that specifically says it? You're allowed to say, well, if a reasonable, ordinary person had, knowledgeable about the state of the art, had been able to think about it, then that's not obvious. And I think this problem is particularly severe with software because there's not the kinds of breakthroughs you have in other fields. You don't invent, a new chemical compound or anything like that. It's all about putting together these very standardized pieces into new shapes that are
now one of the the point of the point of property generally is that if you can't exclude people, so like a piece of physical property, right? If I can't exclude people from coming onto my apple orchard and picking all my apples, then I'm not going to bother, right? Like there's not the point. So the right to exclude often is a precondition for people behaving productively, and so I'm not going to, if anybody can drive off with my car whenever, why would I bother getting a car, right? There's all sorts of things, and if I pour my heart and soul into inventing the widgetizing gizmolator, and then anybody can copy my idea tomorrow, then I'm not going to invent the widgetizing gizmolator to the detriment of humanity, right? So we give people who have come up with some innovation, something that's useful, something that makes our lives better off. We say, this idea is yours, and you exclusively can profit from it for a certain period, because we need to set that incentive into place in order to inspire creativity and innovation. So if you're not now, is the idea that this kind of protection in software doesn't do that that it's in fact counterproductive? Because I can understand. I'm actually on board with the idea that if we need to give people the protection of certain ideas in order to motivate them to produce them, then I want to give them that kind of protection. So why don't I want to give that to people for coming up with interesting ideas in software?
Well, there's two things. One is, again, this copyright point, that it's not the case that if you develop the next great application, people will be able to come along and copyright it and copy it, because you'll have the copyright. And one of the things I think is unique about software as opposed to most other types of inventions is that software is very much about the implementation rather than the idea. I mean, anybody can have the idea, what if I had wireless email? The difficult part is writing the thousands of lines of code and designing the circuits that actually make that happen, and that's mostly computer code that you can get a copyright on, and so people might be able to independently implement the same thing, but they can't directly copy your code. But the more general point is, I think that people buy that story a little too easily. I mean, it's an empirical question. The empirical claim is that if we don't give this class of inventions this type of protection, that you won't get enough of that type of inventions. And I'm not sure that the evidence, certainly in the software context, I think the evidence is very weak. And I think even in the patent issue in general, I think that I'm not sure it's wrong, but I certainly think that people accept it without giving it a lot of critical scrutiny. And one of the reasons is that I think the economic model that people use is this very simplistic sort of supply and demand model, where the moment a competitor comes along and starts selling your competing product, the profit potential in that market immediately drops to zero, right? I mean, because if you have a big enough market, and if the ability to scale up production is slow enough, it might take you 10 or 20 years after you've invented some nifty new gizmo before you're able to produce enough to satisfy the whole demand. And so you might not care if somebody else comes along and satisfies 10% of the market that you wouldn't have been able to satisfy anyway.
And this also brings us back to the point of the possibility of making a good living by giving stuff away. So my former roommate worked for Red Hat, and he's very evangelical about open source software, and all of the software that Red Hat produces is completely free. Like I could get anything more or less that they produce for nothing. But what they do is offer engineers and customer support to implement it, to keep it up to date, to sort of to always update it, to make sure that it's patched against the latest security threats. And this, so what they do is they give away this product so that they can sell you the services around it.
That's right.
And that seems to be a feasible way of making a living. And they insist that that these software ideas shouldn't be protected. That in fact the patents actually preclude the possibility of sort of creative recombination that tends to lead to innovation in the sort of technology, the sort of computer technology sector, and that so that the very function of patents to motivate innovation is like serving the opposite purpose. It's putting barriers up. It's creating these little silos of technology, and it doesn't really matter anyway. So suppose I stole the code for Microsoft Word in 1999, right? That's already obsolete. So, like, if you have a patent over that idea, it's already been surpassed, right?
Right. Exactly. And one of the problems is that you the patents tend to be very broad in a way that precludes people from going out and inventing a competitive product. So Microsoft has gone around for several years now claiming that the Linux operating system, which is the primary thing that Red Hat sells, infringes 230-some patents or something like that, and threatening, we're going to sue you if you don't knock it off. But they haven't been willing to actually give a list of, okay, here are the patents that you've infringed. And in fact, it's quite the people who develop Linux have been perfectly willing to say, look, if you give us the list, we'll go through and we'll change, the relevant parts of the code to try to avoid these patents. But because there are so many patents out there, it is virtually impossible to write a piece of software that doesn't infringe a bunch of people's patents. And this is one of the places where I think the property metaphor really breaks down. Because, if I want to build a house, I find a spot where I want to build that house. I'll go down to the courthouse, I'll look up the records and say, this piece of land is owned by this person, or maybe it'll be on a property land, I'll have to buy two pieces of property. But there's never a case in real property where I want to build one building and there are 300 different property owners, each of whom have a small section of the property, and that they have competing claims, and you're not quite sure where the barriers are. That would be a total chaos, and I'm not sure it would even make sense to call that a property rights system, because the fundamental purpose of the property rights system is to create legal clarity. These software patents, if you actually look at what they are, they're page after page of legalese basically describing a device, and it's your job to figure out, does my invention, is it similar enough to what's described in the patent that a court will find this to be infringing? And, you can pay a patent lawyer several $1,000s to give you his opinion, and he'll probably be right. But when there's, 50,000 software patents, and, 100 of them sound like they might be similar to the device you're thinking about building, and you don't have the $1 million it would take to have a software, a patent lawyer analyze all 100 of them, that becomes, I think, as much a barrier to innovation, probably more of a barrier to innovation, than the opportunity to get a patent yourself is helpful. And so I've become increasingly reluctant to use the property metaphor to talk about the patent system, because I think it's most serious in software because of some of the reasons I've talked about in others. But even in other areas, you have this problem where I don't think that the clear lines, I think, are the one of the essential characteristics of a property system, and I don't think the patent system really meets that standard very well.
Well, Tim, I think we're about we're over time, so that's gonna have to be the last word. We've talked about a lot of ideas of yours that are in your articles in Slate and Tech Dirt and New York Times and elsewhere. I'll make sure that those get linked on the side so people can look them up, and I'm sure you'll feel comfortable if people just go ahead and steal those ideas.
Absolutely. They're welcome to all the ones. If they want to give me credit, I would appreciate that, but they're welcome to them.
All right. Thanks, Tim. It was fun.
All right. Thanks, Will.